Okay, so question number 1 tonight, which is asked by young Mr. Howarth, young Noah. It was Noah, was it? Or was it Jacob? Give me a wave if it was Noah. It was Noah. Right, okay.
Yeah,
so
kind of both of them.
It was a conversation, but yeah.
In a conversation. So the question was, why didn't people recognize Jesus after the resurrection? Which is a really good question. But the simple answer to why people didn't recognize Jesus after the resurrection was that generally they did. And so when you look at all the resurrection appearances, in all those instances, Jesus was immediately recognized. And later on, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says this. He says, he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still living, although some have fallen asleep. What he's basically saying there is, I'm writing this, and if you want some evidence, there's nearly 500 people still alive who saw Jesus. Then he appeared to James, then all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as one of untimely birth. What he's saying there is, well, you know, I came along later. I originally opposed the church, but then I met Jesus when he knocked me off my horse. And one of the things that becomes apparent is in the 2 or 3, there is actually 3 instances where it looks like people didn't recognize Jesus straight away. But what happened was that in all but one instance, as soon as he spoke, as soon as he said something, they realized it was Jesus. So let me take a step back in answering this, because the first thing to say is, well, Jesus was now resurrected. So what was his body actually like? What can we say about his body? Because one thing we do know is it's his resurrection body and not the body that he'd been walking around in for 33 years. It's a resurrection body. We get told that in 1 Corinthians. So what was his body like? Well, first though, it had real substance because they could actually touch him. So it was solid. It feels like you do right at the moment. And, you know, the disciples amongst them, probably not all of them did everything, but they felt put their hands in his side, they put their fingers in the holes in his hands. So he still, that resurrection body, although it was solid, still bore the marks of the crucifixion. Now, the question is then, because this isn't mentioned in any of the accounts, what did his face look like? Because if he still had the holes in his hands, and he still had the hole in his side, and the holes presumably in his feet, although we aren't told that, when he got his resurrection body, did that still bear the marks of the crucifixion as well? In other words, if it did, what Isaiah tells us is that his face was so battered, it was marred beyond human likeness. Now, I'm just throwing that out there because I've got no evidence one way or the other. We just do not know what his face looked like. It could be that he just looked like Jesus, and they just, you know, his resurrection body just still bore the holes and the hole in his side, because that demonstrates his glory and his victory. But we actually don't know what he looked like facially once he had been resurrected. And the other thing we do know is that he definitely wasn't wearing his grave clothes, because if you remember from Easter Sunday, they were actually all folded up in the tomb. And he definitely wasn't wearing his own clothes that he was wearing before he went to the cross, because they got gambled for by soldiers. So he's wearing some sort of completely different outfit. And it might be like dazzling white or whatever. You can let your imagination run wild. But other things we know about his body, he could eat. In fact, he did eat. He eats rather a lot. And he could teach. So he could think clearly, he could explain himself. But what we also know is that his resurrection body, he could just appear in a room, just like that. In Luke 20, verse 19, it talks about how the disciples went and shut all the doors. Now, that word, basically what it's saying is that the disciples were all getting together for dinner, and they made certain that the doors were shut. And the word there is a Greek word, thura, Thura. And so what that is saying is that the door itself was large and solid, and it had been bolted. They had these huge deadlocks, you know, the big bolts that you put through, great big things. That's how they had shut that door. And yet Jesus, in his resurrected body, was able to appear straight in the room. So there's some things are the same about him and some things are different. And it's kind of trying to understand what that resurrection body is like. Not that it's ultimately that important to the explanation of the question that Noah's raised, but because it's really important to us, because we get one of these. We all get a resurrection body. And that's kind of the good news. That for us who are just, you know, slightly beyond the prime years of late 20s, early 30s, only slightly beyond that, it's really important to me that I get a new functional resurrection body. And the good news is every one of us does. So that's kind of cool. So what is a resurrection body like? Well, we can't tell any more than that from the descriptions of Jesus. You know, it's solid and all the rest of it. Doesn't quite look like the original body, and it can just appear in rooms without going through doors or whatever. So there's something different about it, something the same. Now, what Paul says about resurrection bodies is it's all in 1 Corinthians 15, if you want to look it up later. I'm sure probably Jules will send my notes around with this. But 1 Corinthians 15:38 says that each body is according to its seed. Now, what that means is that although you get a resurrection body, there will be a Les Gannon resurrection body. There will be a Paul Howarth resurrection body. There will be a June Shadbolt resurrection body. We all get a resurrection body that has some relationship to what we're like now. Because you can tell that from some of the parables Jesus tells about heaven and hell and all the rest of it, that people can recognize each other. So we'll know somehow that it's the same person because it comes from this seed of who we are now. But it's not the same, because what Paul then says is the body that you sow is not exactly the body that you get. What he says is this: you do not sow that body that shall be. What he then says, it's sown in corruption, it's raised again in incorruption. What that means is that it's eternal. It doesn't age. It doesn't sort of wear out. There's no like dodgy knees or dicky hearts or anything like that. It's the same always. And then he says it's sown in dishonour, it's raised in glory. What does that mean? Everything that you've got in your body that doesn't function when you pop your clogs, or hasn't functioned for parts of your life and all the rest of it, you get it new. There's no bits that aren't working. And then it says it's sown in weakness but raised in power. It also says sown a natural body, but in return it's raised a spiritual body. Now, what he then goes on to say is something a bit peculiar and might help us understand a bit why Jesus doesn't look exactly the same, but he is recognizable. And he says this: as this image bears that of the man made from dust, that's our original image, bears the image of Adam, who was made from dust, our new body bears the image of the heavenly man, that is Christ. So somehow, when we get our new bodies, they're not coming from that lineage of Adam, who was created from dust. They're coming from that lineage of Jesus Christ, who was the firstborn of the new spiritual men. That's what Paul's saying. And the thing he says about all of this is we get changed like this in the twinkling of an eye. It's not kind of like the Incredible Hulk. We don't just like get angry one day, our eyes turn green, and then our muscles swell, and all of a sudden we're 30-year-olds again. It's not like the Incredible Hulk. It's just like that, twinkling of an eye. Okay, so most of what we can tell is most of that resurrection body is like we are now. There's no comment on what Jesus' face looked like, whether that actually bore the marks of crucifixion or not. And this resurrection body we've got is eternal, it's amazing, it's young, it's vibrant, it's strong, it's powerful, it doesn't wear out, all your dodgy bits are fixed. It's just absolutely amazing. And it occurs in the twinkling of an eye. So that's the good news. So how does that help us with this question of why Jesus wasn't recognized? Well, there's actually 3 instances where he's not recognized. 2 of those can and probably do have natural explanations when you read the text. So the first one occurs in John chapter 20, verse 15. And so, by the way, I'll just put you that verse from Corinthians up. I forgot to put it up at the time. That's where he talks about all the people who actually saw him, who recognized Jesus, knew it was him. Now, John chapter 20, verse 16 is the encounter that Jesus has with Mary Magdalene at the tomb. You might remember it. She goes to the tomb and she's weeping outside the tomb. She's basically, she's gone. It's the end of the night, just coming into dawn. She's weeping outside the tomb, and she's got tears in her eyes. You know, that's what John says. She's got tears in her eyes. She's weeping, and she wasn't facing this person directly, but what the text says is she supposed that the person that she could kind of observed or got her attention was the gardener. And what it then says is that when Jesus says her name, Mary, what the text says is that she turned towards him and said to him, Rabboni. So when he said her name, she knew who it was. There's something in all these instances that is, when people hear Jesus speak, they know who he is. Now, that word for that all takes place in this garden around the tomb. Now, that word from garden is actually a big open space. It's not a little tiny back garden. It's quite large. So when Jesus appeared to her, he could have actually been a little bit of a distance off, rather than right next to her. And that probably accounts for why it says she supposed. That word suppose means that she arrived at the opinion, or she concluded that it was the gardener. Now, when she said that, she wasn't expecting to see Jesus. She thought Jesus was dead. She wasn't expecting to see him. He may have been quite a way off. We don't know. I'm speculating on that one. She's crying, she's weeping, and it's just coming out of dark. Now, remember, they don't have street lamps in those days, so dark's dark. It's perfect conditions for Paul Howard to go out with his stargazing equipment. And they have that every day. There's no street lights. And once the torches are out, there's nothing. And so in the midst of all that, she mistakes this person that she encounters for the gardener. But as soon as he says it's Mary, she turns to him, she recognizes it's Jesus and calls him Rabboni. Now, all of that in itself generally has a natural explanation. The other instance that kind of has, it's got some interesting features about it, but the second instance is in John chapter 21, and it's basically the disciples are out. I don't know why they've gone out, but they've gone out fishing. And they're heading back towards wherever they put the fishing boats. And they haven't caught a thing. They've been out all night, not caught a thing. And somebody shouts at them from the shore, which is Jesus, and tells them to go and put their nets down on the other side. Now, what we do know is that when Jesus called to them from the shore, they didn't know it was him. But further on in the passage, when they come back with their nets full and they come in towards the shore, it says as they approached the shore, I think it says that they were 200 cubits from the shore, which is about 100 yards. That's regarded as close to the shore. So what that says to me is that when Jesus actually shouted to them, they were actually further away than kind of 100 yards. Again, remember, it's either the end of the night or it's dawn, so the light's not great. And what's interesting is how they recognize Jesus in this one. So they recognize Jesus, and the reason they come back to shore is John twigs that must be Jesus because we've got a miraculous catch of fish. We couldn't have done this on our own, so this must be Jesus. It then says they came back, and as they stepped out onto the land, they saw Jesus, but more importantly, it says they then saw a fire cooking fish. Now, that kind of puzzled me. Like, if I'm out and I'm 100 yards from shore and somebody's lit a fire on the beach, I can see the fire. Would you not agree? So that would suggest to me, just again, speculation, no proof, but what it suggests to me is that Jesus wasn't actually directly in the line of sight when they were out on the water. They heard his voice, they heard him tell them to put down the nets on the other side. They did that. John realizes that Jesus is involved in this. They come back in, and as soon as they land, they see this figure. They reckon, they've already decided it must be Jesus. But then they see the fire, and he's cooking fish, and he eats with them. So again, there's primarily a natural explanation to that. The one which is more does not have a natural explanation. So the kind of different examples. So this is the one where people think, well, nobody could recognize Jesus. Well, yeah, most of the time people recognize Jesus, or there was a natural explanation for why they didn't. But in any event, some point shortly after some of these events, at least 500 people saw him at one time, and they all knew it was Jesus. And people were going around touching him, and he's there stood in the room in front of them. And we know he did lots of teaching before he ascended. So there's no doubt it was Jesus, absolutely no doubt at all. And most of the time people recognize him. But this one, they don't recognize him. And this is the example from Luke chapter 24. And it starts at verse 13, finishes at verse 35. But you know the story. It basically records the story of two disciples. Now, those two disciples aren't any of the 11 who were in Jerusalem who've already seen him. The main 11 disciples have already seen him. Right, big ending on this one, yes. Especially for Noah. Okay, so the one instance where there is a supernatural explanation, because actually the text says it's a supernatural event, is in Luke 24. And it's when Jesus encounters two disciples walking along on the road to Emmaus. And we don't know what they're called. They're definitely not one of the 11 disciples. They're just two other followers of Jesus. We're not told what they're called. And what the account of that is in Luke. And it's Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. And basically what it says is that they were walking along, talking and discussing together. And Jesus He turns up, it says, Jesus drew near and went with them. And then it says this, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. This is a supernatural occurrence. This is Jesus doing something. It's not that they couldn't tell who Jesus was. It's actually that we know from the text that it says Jesus actually made it that they couldn't tell who he was. I don't know how he does that, but he's Jesus. So that's just what we know. And in that case, which is the only instance like this, it looks like God actually kept these guys from recognizing. Now, what then happens is that Jesus explained to them, he talked to them all the way along the road, and it said that he showed them and explained to him all about how the law and the prophets talked about him and pointed to Jesus, because they were concerned. They didn't know Jesus had been resurrected at that time. And they thought that he was dead. And Jesus explained to him all the things about the Messiah from the Bible. And then they invite him in, they start to eat with him, and then they can tell it's Jesus. What it says Jesus ate with them and their eyes were opened and then they recognized him. Now, there's all sorts of ideas about why Jesus might do that. One of the main ideas that people say is that Jesus deliberately hid himself from them, because that's what the text is saying. He deliberately hid himself in order that their faith would rest on the fact that, that it rested on the word rather than on their own senses. That's a possible explanation, but the fact is we actually don't know why Jesus did that. It doesn't tell us. But what is clear is that it was God's will for them not to recognize him, and when they sat down and ate with him, that was kind of taken away. So in answer to Noah's great question, why did people not recognize Jesus after resurrection? The answer to that is generally they did. There's 3 instances where it's not so obvious. 2 of them have a natural explanation. 1 of them has a supernatural explanation, which is actually, we're told it's a supernatural explanation. But Jesus has a new body. And that's the exciting bit for me, because we get that new body. We get that incorruptible, full of life, strong, healthy body that doesn't wear out. And that's just amazing. But what the bit I get really excited about, apart from that, is something that these 2 disciples said after their eyes had been opened again by God, that they could actually tell it was Jesus. And it said they're kind of reflecting on what happened, and they come to this conclusion. They say, well, we should have known, because were not our hearts burning within us when he was teaching us and showing us? And that gets me excited, because that's where I want all of us to be. That's where I personally want to be, that when I hear the word of God, when I come to the word of God, I don't just come to it like a book. I encounter Jesus and my heart burns, and it creates that love and that passion and that absolute joy and desire to live for him. And so that's what I find really exciting about that passage, this idea of their hearts burning within them as they heard the word about Jesus.